Good morning. Is everybody warm enough? I don't know, maybe it's because I'm all alone at the front here. I've been shivering all morning. So if you're cold like me, maybe just, rub somebody's back and warm your hands up on their back or something like that. What have I gotten myself into? Those were the words going through my mind as I was hanging from the side of a cliff. I wasn't doing anything heroic. I was actually just trying to have fun. My brother-in-law and I were nearing the end of a day of rock climbing out at a place called Jupiter Rock, which, if you know where Lac des Arcs is and Hart Mountain, it was right in that little valley there with Hart Creek. We were having a great day, and we thought we would end the day with a fun little lark. We decided that there was this rock formation that looked really interesting. It was actually the reason why it's called Jupiter Rock. It's this big sinkhole in the side of the mountain. And we thought, wouldn't it be fun if we just rappelled down, because we were too tired from climbing up. We couldn't climb up to it, so we thought we'd hike around and rappel down to it and check out this really interesting rock formation. And that cliff face was about 2 rope lengths high, which meant we had to rappel down halfway, bolt ourselves into the rock, and rearrange our ropes and go down. And everything was working fine, except we made one little miscalculation in our plan. Instead of using the proper riggings at the top, we thought we would save time. And we took our rope and we draped it around a sturdy tree, and then we rappelled down. We bolted in, and then we went to reposition in the rope, and that's when we discovered big trees with bark have lots of friction, and our rope wouldn't budge. And so we were just hanging out. What have we gotten ourselves into? We got way more than we bargained for. It was the end of the day, so we called for help. And we were the last persons in that little canyon, so nobody was there to help us. And we pulled and we pulled. We prayed, and then we pulled some more. And by the time it was dark, it took us probably 3 hours to finally get that rope to budge. And when we got to the bottom, I kissed the ground, and we went home late for supper, had to explain ourselves. We got more than we bargained for that day. Today I want us to consider that question. What happens when following Jesus gives us more than we bargained for? We're in the middle of a series of messages entitled Walk This Way, how Jesus calls us to come after him. And we've been looking at various stories from the Gospels where Jesus gives that invitation, come to me. A few weeks ago, Jason was considering the question, what does it mean how do I pursue a full life? And we just looked at the story of Jesus calling his first disciples, and it's just simply coming and following Jesus, following in his way, and becoming his disciple, and learning to live how Jesus would live if he were us. And then the next week after that, we talked about the reality that being a disciple is hardly easy. It's demanding. It can be exhausting. And there, again, Jesus enters into the picture and he says, come to me if you're weary, and I'll give you rest. Today we're going to look at another story where Jesus says, come to me. This one's going to be from the angle of living a life of faith. Sometimes exercising our faith means taking risks. Sometimes those risks take us into uncharted territory. And sometimes taking those risks gives us more than we bargained for. Have you ever, in your life of faith, stopped and wondered, what have I gotten myself into? We're going to look at that question today. I invite you to turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14 starts out with some very bad news. We find out that Jesus' cousin has been executed, John the Baptist, and so Jesus is in grief. And he goes off to be alone so that he can pray and sort through what's going on. And in the midst of all that, the crowds follow him anyway. They don't have time for him to deal with his own personal problems. They have needs. And so they chase him down, and Jesus has compassion on them in the midst of all that's going on in his life. And he heals their sick. And then with the help of his disciples, he ends up feeding a crowd of them, of thousands upon thousands of people. And after this ministry time, this amazing ministry time that Jesus and his disciples had, we pick up the story where I want to read from today, starting in verse 22. Immediately after this feeding of the 5,000, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake. And while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up to the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble. Far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid. Take courage. I'm here." Then Peter called to him, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you, walking on the water." "You? Yes, come," Jesus says. So Peter went over the other side of the boat and walked on water toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and he began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. "What have I gotten myself into here?" That was what Peter was at least thinking when he wasn't shouting, "Save me." What happens when following Jesus gives us more than we bargained for? We can observe two responses here in this story. The first response is that of the disciples. I like to call it risk aversion. Project management speak coming out. John Ortberg wrote this book with this long title, "If you want to walk on water, you got to get out of the boat." And in this book, he calls these disciples boat potatoes. You see, their fear got the best of them. Fear made them freeze. Ironically, the scary thing that gave them all this fear, it wasn't the storm. It was when Jesus showed up. It's a ghost. It's like they couldn't trust themselves anymore. They couldn't even trust their own eyes. And so they freeze in fear. How many of us, when Jesus enters into the picture, when Jesus steps into our reality, do we get afraid? Sometimes he steps in and he says, "Come, follow me." Or deny yourself. Pick up your cross. When he upsets the balance of our comfortable lives, how easy is it to freeze? One way that I know I feel the temptation to freeze is just to manage my own life. If I just play it smart, if I work hard, if I cover all my bases, if I make so-and-so happy or so-and-so happy, everything will be okay. I don't have to worry about taking risks if I just play it safe. The thing is, if I play it safe, I miss out on an amazing opportunity. See, sometimes God gives us this gift in the form of an opportunity to grow. And when we get this gift offered to us, it's often a chance to stretch out of our comfort zones. And John Ortberg, in this same book by the long title, says that we can go one of two ways when we are presented with this opportunity. And one way says, the gift is so valuable that I can't risk it. It's like keeping fine china that you were given or inherited away in a box somewhere because it's just too special to risk taking it out. Or there's the other way that says, this gift is so valuable, I must risk it. because there's no tragedy like the tragedy of an unopened gift. Ortberg elaborates a little further this line of thought here when he writes, quoting Dale Bruner. Dale Bruner writes, "It's important to see here that Peter didn't ask Jesus for a promise. For example, 'Lord, promise me I won't sink,' but specifically for a command. 'Lord, if it's you, command me.' Peter didn't ask for a guarantee, just an opportunity. The disciples who stayed in the boat were followers of the first way, the way that said, the gift is too valuable to risk. I can't risk it. They didn't want to risk brokenness or failure. They treasured safety over growth. The ultimate adventure of faith was something they were content to watch from the sidelines. Let them stand for all of us who ask not for a command, but a promise, who seek not a mission, but a guarantee. Playing it safe robs us of the chance to grow and experience the full life that Jesus intended for us. With that in mind, that leads to a second response, which we see demonstrated by Peter. Now, if we have risk aversion, we have risk affinity, and that was definitely Peter. Peter was one of those people that said, the gift is so valuable, it must be risked. If it's you, Lord, tell me to come, and I'll do it. He's a boat jumper, not a boat potato. And Peter got this, right? It's good to take risks. And he went through with it, and everything was wonderful, right? Well, he didn't freeze. Jesus showed up, and he was all in. He had the faith to hop out of the boat and walk toward Jesus. But then his eyes got really big. He saw the wind, he saw the waves. Things just got real. In his panic, Peter is realizing here in this moment that there's more to life than just being an adrenaline junkie. This reminds me of a time when some friends and we stepped out in faith, and then things got real. About 2 years after we moved from here to Montreal, all of the things fell into place. It was amazing. And we were able to start a house church with some of our closest friends that we had in Montreal. And this was really exciting for all of us. All of us were used to like normal church life, the normal church experience with buildings and programs and people. But we were eager to try something new. And we were restless to step out of the boat, and so we did. And at first, it was a real rush. It was so much fun. We got getting together on Sunday mornings in people's houses. We singing together, eating together, studying and fellowshipping together. We were telling other people about what we were doing and how excited we were, and other people joined us along the way. But it didn't take very long after we began for this choking, panicky kind of feeling to set into our little fledgling community. First off, we got crowded. And try to imagine a little townhouse. Some of you visited us when we were in Montreal, or you visited Gunnar and Chantel Littlejohn. They live in the same kind of townhouse as us. Try to picture 25 people huddled in there, where over half of them are under the age of 12. It was very difficult to maintain order. Instead of encountering the Lord of the Harvest, there were some mornings where it felt like Lord of the Flies. It was crazy. And it's funny, and kids can figure out when they outnumber you, and but it can get chaotic. So we got crowded. We were misunderstood. One of my friend's families actually openly criticized him and them for not being able to figure out when are you guys gonna like get over this and like go back and do real church. And it was kind of a hurtful thing. And this led to confusion. We got confused. Like, we were making this up as we were going. How sure were we about this? And if we're not going to be doing real church, are we messing our kids up by not putting them in real Sunday school? That was a big question that we wrestled with. Now, that experience of it getting real for us may not have been as intense as it was for Peter, this moment that he stepped out of the boat. But after the original rush of us stepping out of the boat in Montreal, we began to wonder, what have we done? What have we gotten ourselves and our families into? Our eyes were getting bigger as we realized that there's more to life than being spiritual adrenaline junkies. So what happens when following Jesus gives us more than we bargained for? I wonder if anybody here can relate to these two responses this morning. One response is fear. Like the disciples who stayed in the boat, we freeze. We become boat potatoes, even when Jesus shows up. And the problem is when we let the fear get the best of us, life will simply pass us by. We'll miss out on this opportunity to grow. We miss out on the joy of being used by God in amazing ways. Another response is panic. Like Peter, we can step out in faith, but get quickly overwhelmed. We start with something with a bang, but then we can flame out just as quickly. When things get a little too crazy for us, we can sink into panic, and the temptation to give up can be overwhelming. Do you relate to either of these two responses? I know I do. Whichever response that you're wrestling with today, fear or panic, missing out, giving up, Jesus is standing in the midst of the wind and the waves of our troubles, and he's calling out to us the same encouragement that he called out to the disciples. Take courage. I'm here. Don't be afraid. At the heart of that statement that he called out over the waters, right in the middle of it, is this famous statement, I am. Does it ring any bells? I am. This is language that invokes those moments in history where God has shown up in a big way. The first time that I remember reading about this goes all the way back to Moses and the burning bush. Moses was a Hebrew boy, baby boy, who was miraculously rescued and was raised as a prince in Egypt. And this at a time when Hebrews were slaves to the Egyptian people. As a grown man, he sees that how his kinsmen are being abused and oppressed, and he decides that he's going to step out of the boat. He's going to do something about it. He takes matters into his own hands and he kills an Egyptian taskmaster in a fit of vigilante justice. The next day, things got real. He gets scared and he hightails it to the border and he hides out in an obscure place called Midian. And he hides there for a long time. He settles down. He gets married, has a family. The prince of Egypt becomes a desert shepherd. Finally, life gets a little more comfortable for Moses. Then one day while he's tending his flock, he notices this curious burning bush. And from this bush, God speaks to Moses and he tells him the time has come now for the Hebrew people to be set free from their oppressors, and that Moses was going to be the man to lead the charge. Well, Moses resists. No. He makes every excuse in the book. He got out of the boat once. That was a disaster. I'm not going to make the same mistake he's saying. He's never going to do that again. But God is persistent. He insists. And this is what he says to him. He says to Moses, I am. That's who's sending you to the people of Israel. Yahweh, I am. And I will be with you each step of the way, Moses. Take heart. Don't be afraid. Moses finally takes God at his word, and the rest is history. I am here, God says to Moses. I am here, Jesus says to Peter and the disciples. What happens when following Jesus gives us more than we bargained for? Here's what happens. Jesus says, I am here. Don't be afraid. Don't give up. I welcome your imperfect faith in me. Folks, God is here, and he welcomes our imperfect faith. Faith which is fearful, faith which panics, faith which is flawed. I find this incredibly liberating. I don't know about you, but I find it easy to fall into the trap of performance for God. If I obey God enough, if I work hard enough for him, if I take enough risks for him, it'll somehow validate my identity as one of his servants, as one of his followers. But that's not how Jesus operates. Look at how he acts here when with Peter and the rest of the disciples. For Jesus, the order of things is actually in reverse. When we get trapped into thinking that we need to somehow work our way to prove our identity. From Jesus' point of view, it starts out with our identity as beloved children of God, and from that comes the gifts, the good fruits of good works, of exercising faith and taking risks for God. It's our identity as beloved that spurs on all the other stuff. Let's read the rest of the story. We'll go back a couple of verses here to verse 29. So Jesus says, come. He invites Peter out. And when Peter went over the side of the boat, he walked on water toward Jesus. And when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and he began to sink. And he shouted, save me, Lord. Jesus immediately reaches out and grabbed him. You have so little faith. Why did you doubt me? Peter, you're one of God's kids. How could I do anything but care for you? How could I do anything but help you? How could I do anything but save you? And when they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshiped him. You really are the Son of God, they exclaimed. This is the first time in Matthew's gospel where the disciples get it. Where they see Jesus and they understand who he is, that he's the Son of God. It didn't happen after the Sermon on the Mount with all that amazing teaching and authority. They didn't bow down and worship him then. It didn't happen after Jesus sent them out on mission and help them to understand how to serve in the kingdom, and they came back with their amazing stories of how God used them. They didn't bow down and worship him then. It was here, in the wind and the waves, in the midst of their flawed faith, when they messed up. That's when they got it. When they heard Jesus say, I'm here, take courage, don't be afraid. Cochrane Alliance, God is here right now. So take courage and don't be afraid.